Hello and welcome to another Saturday Night Talkie. We're the Game Huggers and we're here to do some talking and do some chatting. So if you guys brought your ears with, you can lend them to us for a little while and let's just sit and BS about a bunch of video games and stuff. Does that sound good? Woo! Today we've got two guests on the show. We got two guys back. Aaron, you may remember Aaron from last time. He still can't get his little graphic on the bottom of the screen to work, but he's back again. Say hi, Aaron.
Hello.
What are you up to this week?
Most recently I've been playing Yoshi's Woolly World. Actually, I just got that in. It's my favorite Yoshi. Well, it's in my opinion it's the best Yoshi's Island game since the original Yoshi's Island. Because it's not trying to be the original Yoshi's Island anymore. It's trying to be its own kind of fun thing, which I enjoy.
That is awesome. And we also have Richard or Coolor. Who would you prefer to go by? Is it Rich?
You can just call me Rich.
Well, hey, Rich, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm really excited to have a new face and a new voice on the show. This is going to be an exciting time because we've got some interesting topics. What exactly is it that you guys would like to talk about this week? I know we were chatting a little bit earlier, but we're going to try to pinpoint what we consider to be the worst game console of all time?
The worst game console, that is correct.
Yep.
And that's just our opinions, right? We're not going to sit and try to debate statistics and what actually is the worst of all time, or is this just going to be...
Now, that's not really something that we ever really established, because I don't think we're talking about our least favorite game console. We're talking about what we could consider objectively in some way to be the worst, but what that entails is kind of up in the air. Like, how do you define objectively the worst game console?
Okay, cool. I like that.
It's like subjectively what we objectively consider the worst game console.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just in the sense that it's not based on like, oh, it has Mario games, and I hate Mario games, so I hate the system.
Right.
That makes sense. Cool. I'm excited to talk about what I consider to be the worst game console. Who would like to start and get the ball rolling on what their opinion is?
I'll go first. Why not?
Oh, Aaron, you're going to go first. This sounds awesome.
I think the worst game console ever, I know there are some people that perhaps disagree with me, but I think that the worst game console ever is the Sega Saturn.
Boo!
And I think it's the worst game console ever because it was kind of misguided, I think. It was focusing, perhaps unintentionally, on 2D over 3D, which was a problem, as Richard has his little games in the background there. And I think it killed Sega. Like, I think Sega could have recovered from the CD and could have recovered from the 32X. And I think that the CD is actually a better console, which I know is going to rustle some jimmies there. But
it's an add-on. It's not a console.
That's true. It's a cancerous blob. But
it is.
I think the Saturn just kind of, like, once the Saturn came out and Sega failed to support it really as well as they supported the Genesis, and they failed to get third-party support, and it was a pain to develop for, partially because of their hardware design. It killed them. Like, there was no way, like, no matter how good the Dreamcast was, it couldn't possibly allow Sega to recover. And you expect Sega to do better. It's not like, with, like, what was the one after the TurboGrafx 16 that came out, the PCFX? It's not like that where, like, oh, we have a little bit of a reputation for this company and then they make crap. Or, like, the Magnavox Odyssey where you have, like, no reputation and they make something that's arguably not games.
Well, the PC Engine in like 1987 was in the end of 87 and early 88 was like the #1 selling console in Japan. It was beating out the Famicom. That was the #2 best-selling 16-bit console in Japan as well. It just destroyed the Mega Drive, which is the Sega Genesis over in Japan. So when NEC was announcing that the PCFX was coming, there was a lot of hype behind that. They just went in a really bizarre direction with it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but to
just 'cause
argue that
just
they
'cause
were
no
as
one's
big
heard of
as
it here.
Sega is like, yeah, but Japan's a very small market. Like, it still is. Like, at the time, it was pretty small, and it still is pretty small overall.
I think at the time they were bigger than here.
Yeah, in the 90s, games were, I think between the Europe and the Americas, they actually did wind up outselling Japan in certain spots. Like I know that Sega did much better in Europe and America compared to Japan for a long time, up until the Sega Saturn. Saturn was Japan's #1 selling Sega system of all time. And here's something I'm going to preface this whole thing with. Aaron told me his opinion on his Sega Saturn being the worst console of all time about 2 weeks ago. So I've had a long opportunity to sit and marinate on this. But had this been the first time I heard it, I will just go ahead and react the way that I reacted when I first heard him, and that was by saying, Aaron, you're a fucking moron! Because saying the Sega Saturn is the worst console of all time is so far left field bizarre, and I
Just
understand.
wrong. It's objectively
super
wrong.
I mean, it's super wrong. I can understand when you're saying that it was a system that doomed Sega, but that isn't even true because the Saturn sold better than the Sega CD add-on. It sold better than the 32X add-on. It sold better than the Master System, which was a standalone console. The Saturn was only behind the Dreamcast and the Genesis in their whole legacy of systemware. The problem happened with the Sega CD and the 32X when Sega kept promising people, this is the next generation, this is where we're going with the system. And they'd go a year and a half, and then, man, we're sorry, we were wrong, here's the next thing. And then the 32X failed instantly. I mean, like 500,000 32Xs sold in the US market. And then in Japan, it basically didn't even exist. When the Saturn came out, it was doomed before they even had a chance to get out there. Like, someone was going to jump onto the N64, or they were going to go with the PlayStation because there was just no trust left at that point. It didn't matter if the Saturn was a fucking machine that could do arcade quality instantly, like better than anything else. It wouldn't have mattered what they came out with. And as far as like being a weird system that came out with 2D graphics in a time when it was supposed to be 3D, I think Sega took a look at the market and said, okay, here's what we've seen so far. The Super Nintendo is kicking ass. The Genesis is still selling really well. It's 1994, 1995. Let's see, the Atari Jaguar came out and failed humongously. The Panasonic 3DO came out and failed. Why? Because it's early 32-bit graphics of 3D. Maybe this is not the direction we need to go. Maybe because these two are failing so bad, we don't want to associate at all with this. So let's put out a 2D monster that's just going to emulate all of those arcade games perfectly. And it did. Like, all of those 2D games look wonderful on it. It is the perfect succession of 32-bit from 16 and 24-bit between the Neo Geo and the Super Nintendo. It looks perfect, and that is what got my attention. Like, I was super attracted to that. And by the way, it doesn't do 32-bit 3D graphics all that poorly. Like, there's some really good-looking 3D games on the Saturn. That's just my opinion.
I think it's worth noting that it's one of the common complaints you get about the Saturn that is really just not that true. Because the Saturn, like, they made some strange decisions with it, but at the time, if you look at them, they're really not that strange because back in '94, 3D graphics were in their, like, real-time 3D graphics for computer games were still kind of in their infancy. So this idea that they used quads and that, you know, quads are weird and nobody would ever do that, well, not in '94. Nobody knew where it was going to go. Quads could have very well been the future, which, for people who are unaware, I don't know if you guys know the details on that, but basically the basic unit of geometry for the Sega Saturn is a 4-point, polygon instead of a 3-point polygon, which nowadays nothing does that. Nothing deals in quads natively. They all use triangles instead. So nowadays you look at it, it looks really weird, but back then the decision made perfect sense. And you can actually do a lot with quads that you can't do with triangles. Something about like putting a point that isn't on the same plane as a quad, and then it'll like Bezier curve up, whereas with tries you'd have to have like hundreds of tries to get that effect. So there's actually a lot of good reasons that they went with the hardware that they went with, in that it was basically state of the art when it came out. It just didn't, the industry didn't end up moving in the direction that was, on the same level as where the Saturn was going. That makes sense.
And that, yes, absolutely. That and the Sega Saturn was incredibly hard to program on. It was a system, and those kits, like development kits, that Sega got out to a lot of developers really late and kind of surprised everyone when they released the console as early as they did without having any third-party support instantly, and it pissed off a lot of third-party developers. It was really weird and strange decision-making for sure, but it's
another common complaint that you hear, but honestly, I don't think the Saturn being that hard to program for made that much of a difference. And the reason is the N64 was also extremely hard to program for.
And expensive.
Yeah, and extremely expensive to develop for. That didn't really make that much of a difference. I mean, it lost to the PlayStation, obviously, but mostly that was just a result of the PlayStation being so hugely popular and cheap to develop for and things like that.
Well, yeah, the PlayStation was cheap to develop for and all of that, and that's why it won. It's basically like third parties flocked to the PlayStation because it wouldn't be considered easy to develop for nowadays, but at that time it was way easier and way cheaper to develop for than either the Saturn or the N64. And the N64 is probably Nintendo's biggest flop. But excluding the Virtual Boy. But
I actually think the GameCube was Nintendo's biggest flop. I love the GameCube.
It was massively. No, it was way less successful. It was distant third compared to the Xbox and the PS2. But no, I mean, for the time period, I don't think being difficult to program for makes that much of a difference. I just don't see any evidence of it, because really nothing back then
other than a large amount of third-party games on the PlayStation over
but the PlayStation wasn't. The PlayStation wasn't significantly easier to develop for, and the N64 was just about as difficult to develop for. So if those were really factors, why didn't they affect? Why wasn't it a wider margin?
I think that during the initial 95 to 97, I'd say ish. On the Sega Saturn, before the gap was starting to widen between sales between the PlayStation and the Saturn, between 95 and 97, a lot of those third-party games that came out cross-platform, Street Fighters, Resident Evil, those kind of games, they came out on both systems, and they played relatively similar. I think it's mostly to do with the sales differences here in the U.S., as a reason why third-party developers started to disappear. Especially by '97, I don't know if anyone was making games for the Saturn other than Sega themselves and maybe working designs.
There were also a lot of weird decisions that Sega made, their higher-ups made specifically, with regards to the Saturn in the U.S. If I recall, what's his face, Bernie Stolar, the head of Sega at the time. He basically didn't want anything on the Saturn unless it was a 3D game. And, say what you will about the Saturn, and its 3D and stuff, making a 3D game at all in 94, 95 was not a cheap endeavor. That basically excluded a lot of people from making games for that thing, I think.
Yeah, that was a really strange thing. I think he was their head up until the Dreamcast launched, and they threw so much money at advertising and all sorts of things. If you want to blame someone for the death of Sega, don't look at the
Bernie Stolar,
look at Bernie.
Definitely.
It was a huge hyped-up event, the Dreamcast's launch. I was there on September 9th of 1999. It was fun. It was a great time. But holy crap, did they pump that thing up and wasted a ton of money on advertising and all sorts of other things, giving away freebies. having way too much promised and not being able to deliver on a lot of those things was pretty crazy. But another aspect that you can look at in more defense for Sega here is the controller. And I think that if you're going to talk about worst consoles of all time, you have to think about playability, how games play, how games feel. And the Sega Saturn, in my opinion, of that generation or kind of even ever, has my favorite game controllers. I absolutely adore the Saturn controller. I think it works perfect for fighting games, platformers, RPGs. I mean, it's got a very basic feel to it. It's basically a 6-button Genesis controller, but the D-pad has been updated, very loose, very smooth, very clean feeling to it. It's very precise to try to make those angles. Also,
I actually got a 3D pad.
Yeah, the 3D, when it started to come out, we got an analog stick or an analog bubble. Got the 6 face buttons there and 2 LNRs. And if you didn't, if you weren't a big part of the 3D, you never had to play with the 3D controller. But what I absolutely fell in love with was the Virtua Fighter stick. And this thing is for arcade games, for all the King of Fighters games that came out in Japan, for all the Virtua Fighter games, Street Fighters, all the Capcom, the suite of Capcom games, Night Warriors and Darkstalkers. This is, I mean, like if you want to compare this to the N64, nothing like this came out on the N64. I mean, there's a reason why Sega beat Nintendo in Japan in this generation. It's the only time they ever beat Nintendo in anything was they Saturn outsold the N64 in Japan because of all these amazing arcade conversions. I absolutely love the Saturn controller. I think it's better than the Dreamcast controller.
I actually got to disagree with that one because in the States, the Saturn didn't have that nice controller you're talking about. It had the really shitty one.
It did have a shitty one.
Bubble,
you're right, but
like the Bubble Plus pad and all that stuff. Like
they're awful. They did wind up fixing that, similar to the way that the Xbox came out with the S controller after the Duke was being complained about or whatever. I think it was about a year later when they came out with the new Saturn controllers. But yeah, that's right. It did launch with a horrible controller. That thing is a beast.
Like at that point, though, like the damage is done. You know, like,
yeah, that's true.
No one's gonna have the fancy new controller. They're all gonna have the shitty ones. So. I just think it's unfair to say that a system that did as well as it did in Japan and that has as many good games as it has, such as the Saturn, could be called the worst console ever. Under any circumstances.
I think that it depends on what you're thinking of for worst, but like I'm using like the same kind of criteria that the Top Gear guys use. And they're talking about the worst car ever, and it's not about what is actually like really technically objectively the worst, but what was a combination of being bad, but also not being expected to be bad. You expected something better from it. You expected something better from Sega than the Saturn.
But Sega had put so much effort into things like the Mark III, and when they brought that over to the US as the Master System, and it flopped. I mean, it got its ass kicked. It had like less than 1% of the market in the 8-bit world compared to the NES. Why don't you call that the worst console of all time, Aaron?
Because you didn't like that was like Sega's like first real console in the US, so you didn't really expect that. There wasn't like a build-up. There wasn't a reputation for them. It was just like, oh, look, here's our first thing. Oh, it kind of flopped. Oh, whatever. Well, here's the Genesis. Oh, you all love that? Yay!
Around the time that the Mark III and the Master System were coming out, Sega had basically conquered arcades. They brought all of those games, all the Outruns, all of the Shinobis, like all those arcade hits came out on the Master System. Afterburner and Space Harrier. I mean, it flopped still after all of that. I mean, they had a lot of hype going into the Master System. I'm not saying that it's a bad system either, because I can't. Nothing with the title Sega on it, none of them. I mean, maybe the 32X. Maybe the 32X. But you cannot consider any of them as the worst console of all time. I actually would consider the N64 to be, in my opinion, not that I would say that it is the worst console of all time, but I would put that up on a higher level of being worse than any of Sega's consoles, just because it completely screwed over Nintendo with all of the momentum that they had with the Super NES.
I don't screwed over Nintendo with their momentum. I don't know. Like,
Not a single
It's
developer
sold
that
way
that
better than the Saturn.
oh no, it's not. But like all of the developers that were on the Super Nintendo jumped when they found out Nintendo was going in the N64 direction. The controller, the cartridge based, like all these things that we
I
didn't have
think.
Konami, you didn't have Capcom, you didn't have Square anymore.
Well, they did have Konami and Capcom actually. I think all throughout the life of the 64, they were making like they weren't making their
Not until 98. 98 was when they both re-signed.
Oh, I didn't know that. But yeah, they. I mean, I don't know where I'm going.
They launched with like Nintendo themselves and Midway, and I think the Top Gear games with Keemco. Like that was a lot of what they had launched with. And when you think of third-party titles, I mean, Konami had Castlevania 64. Mega Man Legends came out on the N64. Capcom brought out Resident Evil 2 on the N64, but those were all later, like 2 years after they had come out for the PlayStation. I,
That
I
makes
don't
sense.
I
I
don't
think it's.
hate the N64. I dislike it a lot, but I don't hate it. Hate it. There's a lot of great games. I mean, a handful of games that are amazing on the N64 for sure. I think THQ and the wrestling games they came out with were out of this world on the N64. But I think that as far as momentum wise, it's weird how the drop off of like the variety of genres that we had on the Super Nintendo was bottlenecked to this controller on the N64, and it screwed everything over, in my opinion. You had 3D platformers, and you had first-person shooters, and sports titles. But where were the RPGs? Where were the shoot 'em ups? Where were Running Gun? Where were like all these games that we had gotten on the Super Nintendo? Oh, they're on the PlayStation and the Saturn now.
I
I
think
mean,
it had. I think it had a lot less to do with the controller and a lot more to do with the cartridge format. Just because cartridges, yeah, you have no loading times. That's really nice, but they're
that's
also a
true.
lot smaller, especially back then when memory cost a lot more than it did nowadays. Like the N64 games were not big at all, and that's also why you couldn't have those really pixel art heavy games. Is because pixel art is actually way bigger. It's like way bigger to have a sprite sheet than it is to just have a low poly model with some static textures and just have
Yep.
it animating. So I mean, if anything caused the N64 to have less of those genres, that would be it. And they tried to rectify that with the 64DD.
Yeah.
Maybe they could have pulled it off. It would have been a miracle save if they had, but that ended up getting delayed over and over again until it was no longer relevant. So
But I think that with Nintendo, the NES, and the Super Nintendo, that Nintendo had the demand of all third-party developers. They were like, we want to be on your system. We have to be on your system. When the N64 hit and there was competition, like they did not take Sony seriously. Obviously, Sega didn't take Sony seriously either. They thought they were going to be the same thing as the Philips CDI or the Panasonic 3DO. These big companies that don't have any video game experience are coming in and trying to throw all their big console out there with all their ideas, and it's just going to flop. We don't have to worry about that. Sega was so worried about Nintendo. Nintendo was only worried about Sega, and they both completely missed the boat on what everyone wanted, and that was more of what they got on the last generation, just times 1,000. Like the PlayStation 1, the variety of genres is out of this world. Like that system has every type of game. Like every single one that we'd ever seen was on the PlayStation. And the console's history, I mean, it went from like 95 to 2005, and like the last games were developed on it in 2005, like 10-year history of that console. It just blew everyone out of the water. And Nintendo being just so unprepared, it was really strange. They just were very confident, almost overconfident, I'd say. And that is why I would say, in my opinion, the N64 is more of a disappointment to me than even the Sega Saturn as far as sales or what anybody's opinion should be. I actually think that the N64, as far as like games that are a ratio of good games to bad games, is worse as in a flop, like is more of a flop than the Virtual Boy.
well, but the Virtual Boy has like two games, and like two of them are good. So
There's 16 games and like 14 of them are good. That's
Yeah.
actual, like there's great
Yeah,
games.
it's like 16 or something. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not a fair comparison at all. Come on. No,
Yeah.
I don't think any system from that era can be called like disappointing at all, really, because there was so much craziness going on in the early 32-bit, like early 3D era of gaming. There were all these new genres that were popping up that were being like refined, and just it was so much craziness. The N64 was the place to get 3D platformers. Like it was the system that had 3D platformers on it.
But it didn't have the best one. Spyro.
Spyro is just a ripoff of Banjo-Kazooie.
I'd say Mario 64 is a fantastic game, but the N64 is just littered with games that are copies of it. I mean, over and over again, and you have 4 buttons on a controller that are all labeled C. So what are you going to use with that? Probably camera, because that's all you can do with them.
Well, they came up with some other interesting uses, like, I mean, okay, they had the C buttons as the camera buttons explicitly. Like, I think they designed a lot of the weirdness with the controller was specifically designed because they didn't know if the whole thumbstick joystick thing was going to catch on, so they had to have the plus pad just in case nobody wanted to use the thumbstick. I think they figured that going into 3D, having all these fancy new 3D games, you were going to need buttons specifically for camera controls. So that was the reasoning behind the C buttons. That just happened to work in 3D platformers really well, but really before there's any 3D games to base that knowledge on, you could see it being applied to any kind of 3D game, really. Like in a car game, hit C up to go into the cockpit, hit C down to view your car from outside or something like that. Like there's
like Beetle Adventure Racing?
Probably. I don't remember what the C buttons do in that game.
Cruisin' USA.
Game is awful.
Beetle Adventure Racing. Beetle Adventure Racing is amazing.
Beetle Adventure Racing is actually really good.
They had a lot of really good racing games actually on the N64. Now that I think about it,
Racing, 3D platformers, kart racing, like all of the kart racing games are on the 64.
pretty much.
I mean, it was just a lot of it. I think just came down to expense. I mean, the 64 was expensive. Of course, it's going to sell less. Shit, games were what, $80 back then? That's a lot of money.
It was crazy.
It did outsell the Saturn by a lot. Like not by a small margin. Like the Saturn had like, what is it? I'm looking at VG charts.
He's going to Wikipedia.
VG Chart says the Saturn had 8.82 million units sold over its life, and the N64 had 32.93 million units.
I think the reason
Saturn only had 1.83 in the U.S. That is ridiculously low.
I think a lot of what that had to do with was people were expecting there to be some kind of... Oh, excuse me. Wonderful to do on live camera. I think people were expecting there to be some kind of like killer app for the Saturn, but it didn't really have anything like that. Like they were expecting some kind of Sonic game, and somehow they just totally flopped on that completely.
And that's entirely Sega's fault. Like they had all the control over that.
I think Sega was going in with the idea that they could just port a bunch of arcade games like Virtua Cop and Virtua Fighter and Virtua Racing and Daytona USA, and everyone was just going to freak out over that. Unfortunately, the only one that played, pretty much identical to the arcade was Virtua Fighter 2, and that problem with that is that I think it was about a year and a half after it had already been out in the arcades, so it was kind of like, oh, we're playing this game that is years old, and then PlayStation's like, hey, we have Battle Arena Toshinden and Tekken, and it's like, these games are newer. They're brand new. They've just been developed. They're out now, and they have all the things that Virtua Fighter has, except for their little bit better graphics and newer moves and all kinds of stuff. So Sega really, they just missed the boat. And that's what they had done in the past by just porting a bunch of arcade games and then having Sonic. And it worked. So they didn't evolve very quickly with what was in demand in the U.S.
Didn't you say, though, that the Saturn was great for arcade games, and now you're saying that like only one of them was actually worth playing that was ported over.
Out of the
I mean,
three that I said during a launch, yes, there was Virtua Cop, there was Daytona, and Virtua Fighter 2 that were ready at launch. I think Virtua Fighter 2 is by and large the best of those three. Daytona's fine, but it doesn't look or play like the arcade did. If I'm talking about 2D arcade games like the Street Fighters or Metal Slugs or King of Fighters, I mean, I could go on and on. They play identical to what the arcade does. Street Fighter Alpha 3 plays better on the Saturn than it did on the Dreamcast. Like, it's amazing. It is out of this world. And if you compare those to the PlayStation games, it's a joke. Like, PlayStation game would be still loading, and it loads between rounds, and it has all these horrible, horrible slowdown and these graphical glitches, whereas the Saturn just plays it flawlessly. I mean, that's where my bread and butter is. That's what I love and I still love, because I think those mid-90s 2D games have aged so much better than mid-90s 3D games.
Like you're talking about using the non-bubble controller, right? Because there's no way that bubble D-pad was better for fighting games than, like, that thing was awful.
It was awful.
If you're into fighting games, you get a fighting stick. You don't use any controller.
Yeah, the Virtua Stick was ready at launch.
Okay.
But you were saying it's entirely Sega's fault. That's not the Saturn's fault, though. Like, no one's going to argue with you that Sega was horribly managed back when the Saturn came out. Like, they had Sega of Japan basically fighting Sega of America. They had Sega of America trying to push the 32X, and then Sega of Japan just being like, what? No, we don't like that thing. Whatever. Like, their management was awful. And that is, I would say, without a doubt, why Sega died. It had nothing to do with the Saturn. Everything to do with just Sega was not a well-managed company.
If the Sega 32X had never happened, I honestly believe the Saturn would have sold better. Because if the Sega CD had come out in like 91 or 92, there was like a nice 2-3 year gap in between the Saturn, but they threw that fucking 32X in the middle of it and just confused the shit out of everybody, because Nintendo was like, we're coming out with a new system. Don't upgrade your system until we tell you we're going to, do our new system. And Sega's like, oh, well, we're here already. We got it. We got 32-bit graphics. And it's like, this is 32, but so is the Saturn. So now we're confused. Like, does that mean we don't have to buy the Saturn if we got the 32X? And, oh, all the 32X sucks. And there's no games coming out for it anymore. Does that mean the Saturn's done? Like, it was just this horrible, confusing time. And the Saturn should not be blamed for any of this. It is Sega of America's fault. It is the 32X. The Saturn, man, I think you just need to give it some love. You need to give it another chance.
It's a piece of crap. Like, I've tried playing with it, and I just can't.
On an emulator? Come on.
Saturn emulators actually suck.
On Richard's Saturn, I've played it.
I had like 2 games when you lived here.
This is true.
I have like 4
One of them
games.
was Knights.
Knights is
Was
good.
like Knights.
Knights is fun. Knights is like Sonic, but
It's
flying.
fun.
You should have liked
okay.
Knights.
Spyro's better.
Are you talking about like a game that came out in 98 and a game that came out in 96? And 95, 96? I don't even know what.
I don't think Spyro the Dragon came out in 98. When did it come out?
I think it did come out in 98.
Yeah, Knights.
They managed to release 3 of them in 2 years. Well, I don't put that against them, actually. That's entirely possible. But I don't think it...
That one Knights? Yeah, that one is Knights.
He's got Knights, and I got Knights. I got the big box with the 3D pad in it. It's a fun game. I won't say that it's Mario 64. I never ever thought that it was Mario 64. It's a different style. It's more arcadey. It's a really unique console game. It's a really unique idea. Is it the killer app? No, I don't think it is. But it doesn't suck. It's weird to think that someone would think that it sucks. I don't know. What was your reason, Aaron? You were talking about how like there's a lot of pop-up graphics and there's fog or something. Like that's the problem with it.
The draw
It's a
distances
2D.
are way better on the Saturn. Or way worse on the Saturn than they were on the PlayStation.
That's because the PlayStation had like a million polygons. Like the pop-up is a way bigger problem on the N64 too. Like
Yeah, it is. And fog in every goddamn.
fog is a huge issue in N64 games. Like the PlayStation could just push 1,000,000 polygons like it was no big deal. So I mean, comparing the graphics to the Saturn, I don't know, a little unfair.
This is why the PlayStation
and it didn't make
is the best.
It didn't make that big of a difference. Like, to people back then, we didn't care. It was 3D. That was cool. We don't care about pop-up or fog or things like that. Like,
It's true. Like Star Fox on the Super Nintendo was so revolutionary, and a lot of people were like, "Well, it looks like paper graphics or it's real early polygons." I didn't care. It was beautiful. Like I couldn't believe what I was seeing. These 3D polygons and this like sci-fi shooter was just out of this world.
It's actually kind of interesting. Apparently, according to one of the people I know who programmed Star Fox, one of the people who programmed it, like they could technically do as many polys as they wanted with the Super Effects chip. It was like they're like the frame started to drop when you got to a certain level, and like that was one of the biggest problems with Star Fox, right? Was the frame rate, but it was definitely a fun game. But yeah, I would say Star Fox is a better game than Knights.
That's such a weird comparison.
It is a really weird comparison. Knights is like the problem with like 3D graphics and Knights is a 2D game in a 3D world. It's like the only time you play anything that's 3D in it is when you run out of time and you have to run around on the platform to like try to find the suit again or whatever.
That really showcases me one of the things that Sega really struggled with, which was translating from 2D to 3D was something that Sega just had a problem with. Like they didn't really know what to do. They weren't as innovative as like a lot of the other companies when it came to switching between the 2D and the 3D. And you see that in Sonic Adventure, which I don't particularly think is that great of a Sonic game. Like I liked it at the time, and then now looking back at it, I'm just like, this is a bad game. It's like,
honestly,
it's pretty poor.
It's one of the interesting things about the Saturn was that they didn't have a Sonic game for it. Sonic Extreme was meant to be the Sonic game for the Saturn. Long story short, they just did not have enough resources going into it. They had like 2 people programming it, and it was supposed to be the Saturn's major killer app. And like there was a 3D engine that was developed by Sega of Japan for Knights that they wanted to use, and then Yuji Naka said, no, you can't use that because I don't want you to use that for some reason, and so they couldn't use it. So they ended up just not having a Sonic game, and I think that really ended up.
That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Sega's mismanagement hurts the Saturn, and it's part of the Saturn as a whole. Like the mismanagement that was going on at Sega is evident in the hardware design. It's evident in like the games that ended up coming out for it.
Hardware design is fine. The games are fine.
Like 12 different it's got all sorts of problems with it.
Yeah,
aside from maybe the controllers.
And during this time of mismanagement and all these horrible people and all this horrible disagreements between the U.S. and Japan, during this time, 2 things happened. The 32X was created and the Saturn was created. Which one is worse, Aaron? Which one was worse? Which one was worse, Aaron?
The Saturn.
You're fucking stupid. Oh my god. The Saturn
has a bigger effect on killing like Sega as a whole. I mean, the 32X that had the 32X and the Saturn like coming out at the same time in different spots in the world. Like I think there was like a day difference between when the 32X came out in the US and the Saturn came out in Japan. Like those kind of things are part of the life of the Saturn itself. Like they're part of how the Saturn itself is supported over time. And Sega could have, when the Saturn was released, they could have done things to save themselves as a company and save the company, and they didn't, and they rested on this console, which was crap.
If they were well managed, they could have saved it.
That's still part of it, though. Are you going to say that is totally a part of the console?
No, because the console itself is fine, and the games that came out for the console are fine. Like, despite the fact that should be a talking point for the Saturn, if anything, is that even though they were a shit company, they came out with this really cool game console that had some really good games on it. Like, I don't see the problem here with the Saturn.
It's like being like, oh, look at this VW TDI. It's fine. Ignore the fact that Volkswagen screwed it over and lied about all this stuff, but it's fine because
Are you
it has a
talking
nice
about
gear stick and it drives
talking
and
about-
accelerates well.
Are you talking
Yeah,
about a
it is.
shitty car? I don't.
Yeah, I
know.
don't know.
I don't even know what.
Something.
I don't
No,
know.
The TDI is a type of Volkswagen that made the diesel engines that there's been this whole issue over because they basically programmed the diesel engines to run weaker than they typically would when going through an emissions test to pass an emissions test.
Well, then it
But these
sounds
are
like that's a
management issues
shitty
that
piece of
affected
hardware.
those.
Sounds like
Yes.
a shitty piece of hardware, which the Saturn is not, because the Saturn's got like lots of good games on it.
Yeah, I liked what you had said about how poorly it was mismanaged, and yet, even despite all that, the Saturn has a ton of games. And we would mention things like how it didn't have that killer app, that big thing that they could advertise, the Sonic game that everyone was waiting for, or maybe some kind of a sequel to one of the other games, or an exclusive Mortal Kombat. You know, something to really show everyone this is on the Saturn and it's on nothing else. You know, even though it didn't have a Mario 64 or a Crash Bandicoot, I don't even know if that's a big talking point there, or like a Metal Gear Solid, right? It had tons of killer games that were amazing, that were just out of this world, that they did poor jobs at advertising and even talking about it. I actually think that Resident Evil on the Saturn plays better than the PlayStation version of Resident Evil. It was like they had extra cutscenes, and it was a special edition version of it. There was tons of games that we never got in the U.S. I mean, Aaron had mentioned it was just under 2 million console sales in the U.S. So of course, a lot of those third-party developers that had came out with games in Japan are going to cut, they're going to cut their losses and say we're not even going to come out with it in the U.S. I mean, Deep Fear was a big game that we never got over here. Shining Force Scenarios 2 and 3 we never got over here. So if you played Shining Force 3 and you got to the to be continued screen, you're like, oh, I can't wait. Oh shit, we're not going to get the next chapters because Sega is just ridiculous. However, there are fan translations that are coming out now of Scenarios 2 and 3, so if you are interested at all. And that's another cool thing, is just the community on the Sega Saturn or even the Dreamcast itself. Very dedicated people out there still doing fan translations, and it's a good thing. I'm really excited about that because I kind of want to play those games in English so I actually understand what's going on. But no, Aaron, there's no way that you have convinced me that the Sega Saturn could be even consideration for worst console of all time. There's just too much good about it.
So maybe we should talk about what other systems we think are the worst of all time.
Yeah, what do you guys think are the worst consoles so I can berate you for a half hour?
Well, I'm weird because I think that I love to find consoles that are obscure, and I love to find unique games, and I like to find the good in something that's horrible. Like I could find a game that everyone's like, this is shit. Well, thinking of a Saturn game like Virtua Hydralite. I don't know if anybody's heard about this game, but it is really tough to get into. But I've played through it, and I actually enjoy the game. I've enjoyed every Hydralite game I've ever played, even the NES one. And they're not good games. They're just not fun. But to play them and really make a connection with it and just play through it despite what everyone else has said. But one system that I would say would be on the top of my radar, and it's not the CDI, and it's not the 3DO, and it's not the Jaguar. It's actually the Xbox 360, and I know there's a gazillion great games for it, and I know there's a ton of awesome stuff for it. My only issue with it is the fucking Red Ring of Death and how absolutely horribly Microsoft handled it for the first 3 years, basically saying this system isn't ready, but we're gonna shit it out right now because we need to get a head start on the PlayStation 3. And for the first 3 or 4 years, for whatever reason, it worked. People were buying it off the shelves. They were going through oh, this is my third Xbox 360 already. It's like, man, why the fuck didn't you buy a Wii or a PS3 at this point? Because those systems aren't failing. This 360 is. And I like the Xbox 360. We got 2 in the house. Currently, both work, but who knows if that's going to be the case this time next week, because those systems seem to fail just about all the time. But I think with that, I play game consoles that are 20, 30 years old, and I have no issues with them. Sometimes I have to change a capacitor on a TurboGrafx 16, or an Atari Jaguar that has a cartridge slot that is exposed, so there's constantly dust getting inside. If I don't leave a cartridge inside, that's a pretty big glitch that it gets dust in there and just doesn't work. But the 360 is like about to become 10 years old now, and it was failing since the day it launched. I don't see how it's possible that I will ever want to own one years from now, and that would be my pick, is the Xbox 360.
Could you even own one in years from now? I think that's the crux of your question.
That's actually a really good pick for a worst console ever, because even despite the games, like, whatever was on it, just the fact that so many people were affected by this system-breaking issue was just horrible hardware design. Like, those things just don't work on a fundamental level.
It's weird. It's weird. It was trendy. It was the hip pick. It was everyone was playing on. Oh, you got the new Madden? I got it on the Xbox 360. Oh, me too, because that's what everyone's doing.
Halo 3.
Man.
Everyone wanted to play Halo 3 when it came out. They were like, "Oh my god, I got to get a 360." But the 360 is such a piece of shit that, like, people wanted it for the games, but man, so many people were affected by the Red Ring of Death. It was really unfortunate. Like,
yeah,
it's kind of funny that you bring that up, because I mean, earlier, before the stream started, Richard mentioned talking about our least favorite popular console. And, like, my pick was totally going to be the 360.
360.
Like, so we're all in agreement that we don't like the 360. But I wouldn't call it the worst console ever made. It didn't have as big of a negative effect on the game industry. Like, the Saturn and the Atari 5200 are two of the biggest negative effects on the game industry.
But it did have a negative effect on, what, millions of people that bought it?
But they still bought it. That's the thing. It didn't actually it didn't end up having a negative effect. Like, as soon as they fixed the problem, for some odd reason, probably because no one was buying them in stores anymore because theirs worked, like, the sales dropped. Like, they fixed the issue with the Red Ring of Death, and then sales of the 360 dropped. Like, no one cared.
That's because there's no other way to play Halo 3 or Halo 4 or whatever, Halo Reach.
Sure, there is. Play Halo 1 or Halo 2 or Metroid Prime.
But you can't. You can't play Halo 2 because that's the other shitty thing about the 360 is as soon as the 360 came out, Live for the original Xbox was dead. They killed it just immediately.
That's a Microsoft management decision, though.
That's true. I'll give you that one.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess as far as, I mean, there's a lot of really bad systems. The Philips CDI is bad. The Nuon, I don't know if you guys even know what that is. It's like a brief DVD player that has some exclusive games for it that look like N64 games, kind of. I mean, these are what you'd consider the worst of all time. I mean, they're terrible. Or some of those handheld consoles you got there, Rich.
My picks for the worst game consoles of all time are game consoles that have 0 games that you can play on them. This is a Nokia N-Gage QD. I have another one here, actually. If I had to pick the worst console ever, it would be this thing, which is a Tiger Electronics Gamecom. But my reason for picking these, they're not popular systems. They obviously never were. But much like Josh, I like collecting obscure game systems. I like scouring obscure game system libraries and finding the good in things that nobody knows about. And basically every game system has a couple games worth playing. I found this to be true basically without exception, except for this thing. And the reason why is because this thing can't play games. It's just not built for playing games. The hardware can't do it. You can't move sprites around smoothly. Like, everything runs at like 2 frames per second. Just the hardware is not capable of it.
It's a Tiger Electronics system, though. You expect Tiger Electronics to make crap. That's all they've ever made is crap.
Yeah. When that Game.com came out, they actually signed a deal with Sega, and they came out with, like,
Sonic Jam.
Sonic Jam was on that, which was Sonic 1, 2, and 3, and Sonic and Knuckles.
Not on the Game.com, it wasn't.
It was wasn't it just like a sample of like 10 levels or something ridiculous? It was just
like 2 or 3 levels from each, yeah.
And then they had like Virtua Fighter on it, I think, and it was like I remember being excited because I saw it, and I'm like, this is really odd that Sega would say, yeah, put our games on it because we want more people to see like our games on more systems. The Game.com came out by Tiger, and then Tiger actually came out with a headset,
The R-Zone.
the R Zone, which is, I guess, meant to compete with the Virtual Boy because it was red and black. But it was one of those LCD Tiger Electronics type games that were sort of similar to like the Double Dragons and the Street Fighters that had come out in like late 80s, early 90s, which were like a pixel or like a LCD pixel on a background that was static of like a color background, and the character would be like. Beep, beep.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. I don't count that because while it is a thing that you can plug different games into, it's not really fair to compare it to a full-fledged game console. Just, it's too limited. Like, it'd be like saying that Game & Watch games are the worst games Nintendo has ever made.
They're actually really fun.
They actually are really fun, but I mean, it's such a limited format. You can only do so much with them. So it's like, I don't know.
It also does have a purpose too. Like you can use it in like films as like a prop. Because it does look like a sci-fi thing. It looks kind of cool. I mean, it's crap as a game console, but it's kind of cool looking.
Yeah, my pick is for game consoles that technically are not capable of playing good games because they don't have the hardware to do so, and that's the Gamecom. It just
There you go.
you will not find a single game that runs at more than like 2 frames per second on the thing, and it's trying to have a Sonic game on it. Like, you just kind of see Sonic chop across the screen in, like, 5 frames. It's just really bad.
Yeah, I can't argue with you at all there. The only thing I can remember about the N-Gage, and I don't know, you have the QD.
Yes.
So, is that the one where when you want to put a different game in, you have to take the battery out and then put the game in?
That's the original. This is actually a slightly better model because the cartridge just plugs into the bottom. It's got better durability. It's got a less shitty plus pad.
And it looks like a taco when you talk into it?
Not this one. That was the original. And the original, I guess you had to like talk like this with the screen thing out, or like this. I don't know. But on this one, it just works like a regular cell phone. So I mean, at the time, I mean, this was what 2004 that this thing came out. It was probably a decent cell phone.
Yeah.
I suspect I only have one game for this thing. That's why I'm not saying it's the worst system ever because I haven't played that much, but. From what I've played, seems an awful lot like the Gamecom, because it's really laggy. It drops frames in the middle of games, which no console should ever do. There's input lag, and that's just because I think these two systems have something in common. They were running operating systems all the time, which nowadays is not that big of an issue. Back then, the hardware was not really powerful enough to do that and run the game at the same time. So I would say there's a good chance the N-Gage is a piece of shit, but I don't know. I have to play it more.
You have to try Tomb Raider on it because Tomb Raider was one of those games that they constantly like pumped out with the N-Gage. So that's when you have to look out and see.
Yeah, I'm gonna get that
how
one.
That plays on it.
I would check out Tomb Raider, and then also check out Tony Hawk. I guess was supposed to be pretty good on the N-Gage, and then Settlers of Catan actually had a board game handheld version on the N-Gage that is actually pretty cool.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, you don't have a lot of sprites on the screen that are flashing all over the place because you have more of a PC like that 3/4 isometric view on that tiny little screen. Who knows how well it looks? But I've heard it plays pretty well. I don't know. I haven't experienced myself, but I'd love to hear your opinion of that if you ever got a chance to try that.
There was some portable that came out that generation that I can't remember. It was like the Gizmondo or something. You guys remember that?
Yeah.
There were a bunch of weird systems like that were coming out around then. Tapwave made one called the Zodiac that was basically a Palm Pilot mixed with the game system, and that one didn't do too well. The Gizmondo, I think, or was it Gizmodo? I think it's Gizmondo.
Gizmodo. Gizmodo is their crappy website.
Yeah. I think the Gizmondo was also a PDA of some kind, but I can't remember exactly. I've never even... Did it even come out? I don't even know if it came out.
I can't remember.
I think it did. I'm trying to look now to see if I can find it, but I think it did come out. Let's see.
Yeah, there was a handful of weird, like
it came out March 19th, 2005. That was another Tiger system.
No, it wasn't. Gizmondo?
Tiger Telematics.
That's a different Tiger.
Oh, that's a different Tiger. Okay.
Yeah, that's a UK-based company.
Regardless, both Tiger and it's competing with Tiger for the worst console of all time.
I mean, I don't know. I've never played the Zodiac or the Gizmondo. You know, if it has one or two good games on it, then, you know, I'm all for it. But that's why the Gamecom is my pick, is because the best game that I've played on it is Lights Out. And that's because just technically it's not capable of anything more than that. And Lights Out is just a game where you press buttons and they light up and turn off.
As a side question, you ever heard of or played the Super Acon or Acon?
No, I want one. I've heard of it. They're really hard to get a hold of.
Yeah, they are. I have a buddy who's got one. We actually have it at the Midwest Gaming Classic in Milwaukee if you want to test it out. It's really weird because it feels and sounds like a Super Nintendo, but it has no good games. It's really weird. But it has the same it's same capabilities as far as parallax, colors on the screen, and like the reverb sound that Super Nintendo games sometimes get when there's like really, really terrible third-party publishers who don't know how to use it, like maybe FCI or someone, or like those early THQ games that were just, oh my god, that's what all those games are like, and it's not good. It's really strange to play one.
Yeah, I've looked up the pricing on them a few times. They're ridiculous. I guess just because they're so uncommon.
Yeah. So if I had to rank the three systems that the three of us have mentioned, I would say the Game.com is probably the worst. The Xbox 360 is somewhere in the middle, and the Sega Saturn, it's crazy to even have it on this list, in my opinion. I don't even want to rank it. I don't even want to rank it. The Game.com and the 360, like those would be what I would consider to be pretty bad systems. The Saturn, I kind of even forget why it was even mentioned.
I would think I would actually say that the 360 is a better console than the Saturn.
It has more games, it has a bigger variety, and it definitely did better in sales. I mean,
and a better controller.
No.
No. I don't like the 360's controller. I don't like it.
If I'm able to play my 360 20 years after it came out in 2025, maybe we'll have this conversation again.
We can revisit this question then.
You won't be able to.
We'll come back to this.
Remember when that 360 came out?
Microsoft will come out with a system update that'll make it automatically not work anymore. It'll just be like, this system will not work anymore, so people have to hack their systems, kind of like people that want to still use Windows XP or something.
They'll probably do that soon, actually. Now they have, I'm thinking like they'll probably have some sort of like cancellation of all Xbox Live accounts on the 360 sometime soon. Now that they have backwards compatibility on the Xbox One, they'll probably be like, hey, maybe you should stop playing those 360 games on the 360 a little bit, and then we can go play on our Xbox One nobody wants to buy. I actually think I don't think Microsoft's made a good console yet. I know it's like a thing that a lot of people. I mean,
I would actually say that Microsoft's best system is the original Xbox. I actually really like the original Xbox.
I think that is their best. Yeah.
At least the original Xbox worked.
Yeah. What would be your least favorite Nintendo console?
Me?
Yeah. Any of you two.
Least favorite Nintendo console. Probably the GBA.
Game Boy Micro count?
Okay, let's not count handhelds.
Not counting handhelds. Man. Least
Home
favorite
console.
Nintendo console? Only consoles. But they're all so good.
GBA's awesome.
They all are pretty good.
See, I said GBA because they never came out with an original Mario game.
That's true, they didn't. A lot of
They only came out with remakes of like everything. So fuck off, Nintendo.
Every Mario game ever made.
Yep.
I always said the micro because it's tiny and I have massive hands and it's just annoying and I don't know why they made it. I
Also,
just get like a.
also, the GBA didn't have a sound chip, and that personally offends me.
Yeah, it was all sampled, and it sounded pretty garbled and.
No, it didn't have a sound chip at all for samples or otherwise. It basically had a left channel and a right channel, and then the original Game Boy sound chip. And so in order to get any kind of samples out of it, you had to program it to software mix like as many channels as you wanted, which works for a more powerful game system, but for the GBA, that's why everything sounds really muffled and awful.
Yeah.
They rectified it with the DS, where they had a 16-channel sample-based sound chip. But
yeah.
Massive tangent there.
I only asked this question because I was hoping you guys were going to say the system that I was expecting you to say. But mine's easy because I brought it up earlier, and that's the N64. I think that every console that Nintendo's done has had some like real positive points to it, but the N64 to me was like a disappointment. So that was my pick, easy pick for me.
Which one did you want us to say?
The N64, because that's what I thought you guys were going to say.
It's really hard decision for me to say the N64 because it also had one of the best, actually possibly the best game ever made in Ocarina of Time. It's like hard to call that system the worst, but then at the same time, it's really hard because I also think that Skyward Sword is the best, is my personal, not the best, but my personal favorite Zelda game. So it's going to be a decision between those two. But when it came to portables, I mean, now I hate the micro because of its size. I actually dislike the DS more. I don't really like many games in the DS.
I have to say the Wii. Honestly, the Wii. Because I can't say the N64 because the N64 was part of that early 3D 32-bit era. There was just too much craziness going on back then. Like, there was so much good to be had from people experimenting so much with 3D stuff. I just really like all of the systems that were a part of that, to be honest. I even like the 3DO a lot.
I do too. I think 3DO is awesome.
But because it was too expensive.
The Wii,
I heard that.
Like, the Wii has good games. It has really good games, but it had a lot of shovelware.
Yeah, it did.
And it just had a really weird, like, it felt like their controller gimmick was cool, but it felt like it was just forced into a lot of games that didn't need it.
Yep.
In really weird ways, like
yep.
Twilight Princess or like Mario Galaxy. Any game where you have to waggle to attack, like, that really annoys me. Particularly because, like, I have this condition called benign essential tremors where my hands shake a lot just normally. So I end up triggering that a lot. Like, I'll end up punching things when I don't mean to. Or in New Super Mario Bros. Wii, like, you hit the thing, or you waggle the controller a little bit to do a spinning jump, or also to extend your jump out a little. But I do that all the time by accident, and it's just really obnoxious.
It's weird that they didn't have it as an option, where you can go into the options and just grab the classic controller and play it like you would Mario 64 or something. It's really odd that they just made it so that you had to play it that way. And that's me too. I feel like there's a lot of games that it was just tacked on because they're like, oh, we can also have them do kickoffs like this in Madden 98 or whatever. Oh yeah, you have to do this to kick off now. That's brilliant. Great idea. Like, no, just all bad ideas.
I mean, the Wii's motion controller is cool, but it's like, it's not general enough. Like, the Wii U has got a good thing going with its massive control pad thing, because you can use that second screen for all kinds of things. But, like, motion controls, you kind of have to, I don't know, it's more specialized. You can't really just take that and apply it to everything.
Like Wii Sports, and that's it. Like, they had the idea for Wii Sports, and they're like, let's build this console. And they're like, oh, man, what do we do? Well, we waggle, so we have to use it. I feel like I kind of would have to agree on the Wii, because even though, like, my personal favorite, like, Mario and Zelda games are on the Wii, and Skyward Sword and Galaxy 2.
Galaxy 2 is
It
great.
also has, yeah, it also has like the worst Nintendo-made games ever. Like I think Mario Kart Wii is possibly the worst Mario Kart game ever made. I
I
feel like
agree.
every
I agree.
Mario Party game made on the Wii was just awful. Um, like Wii Music wasn't particularly good. It wasn't like look at the N64. Mario Kart 64 was good. Mario Party was good. Super Smash Brothers was good. Like even if you don't like the system and the rest of the games, every Nintendo game that they made for it was good.
Yeah,
And
there
even with the
was
GameCube and the Wii, they just started making. Bleh.
yeah,
If,
there was a time when if it had Nintendo's name on it, even if it was something that I wasn't interested in at all, like Pilot Wings, like I would never play this like flight simulator. I have no interest in it at all. But it was made by Nintendo, so I'll give it a shot, and I love it. Like it's so much fun. Pilot Wings and Pilot Wings 64,
yeah, those are
brilliant
great games.
And there was a time when if it said Nintendo on it, there was like just a quality that was above everyone else. Same way I used to feel about Konami and Capcom. It was just like there was something extra special into it. They put more effort into it, better developers. And now, yeah, if Nintendo comes out with Mario Strikers or whatever, the next Mario game is or whatever, it's really hard for me to feel like, I'm not interested in this, but it says Nintendo on it, so I know it'll be a good game. I don't feel that anymore. The Wii pretty much killed that for me, and that's very true, yeah.
I feel like they kind of regained that a bit with the 3DS and the Wii U. But I mean, it's not translating into sales for them, so I'm really scared that they're going to go back and just be like, well, clearly the problem was that our Mario Party games are not as good as they were on the Wii. And then I'm just going to get really mad. Like, if they go to the NX and they're just like, we have this new Mario Party game, and it's crap again, guys. Don't you love it? And then we have Wii Music too. That's what everyone was asking for. Like, no.
It printed money for them, so I can see why they did it. It was a sound financial decision, but I mean, just I don't know. It's hard for me to even talk shit about the Wii because I mean, even if it's the most disappointing one for me, like I still like the Wii. Like it has a lot of good games on it, so I don't know. I'm just a Nintendo fanboy to be honest.
Yeah. I really like the GameCube a lot, and I like the experimentation that they had at the time when they were doing the GameCube stuff, and the controller, it's the best controller ever made, and I really like Luigi's Mansion is probably my favorite.
I might actually have to take this call. Sorry to duck
Oh,
out.
okay.
I'll be right back.
Okay.
Well, the GameCube controller is not one of my favorites, and the only reason I think that, and I would say that I prefer it over the N64 controller.
Yeah.
But that's about it as far as Nintendo's controllers have ever been. I think that it has a lot going for it in ways that it's comfortable in your hand. I think it feels like the molding is fine. I like the L and R triggers. I think it works, even though there's only one, Z trigger. I think it works just fine. There's two analog sticks. They're opposite sides of each other, so one's high, one's low. The C stick is the other one that you kind of use as the camera. It's the face buttons for me. I understand that they did this brilliant thing. They did this brilliant thing by making it so that you have the one big button that you're going to be using most of the time. But again, for me, it kind of cripples it in the style of games that you can have. The GameCube had games like Capcom vs. SNK2. It had Bloody Roar. It had Mortal Kombat games. I could not play those kind of games using the GameCube controller because you had to have a couple punches, a couple kicks, dodges, blocks, things like that. And to have it with a little red button, a giant green button, and two lima beans around it, it just didn't work for me. I just didn't understand why they would do that. And any time that I jumped from the GameCube to the Xbox to the Saturn, whatever games I was playing, it was always like when I came back to the GameCube, I had to wow, why? Oh, that's right, all the buttons are different shapes. Like, I don't want that. I want to be able to have them all the same size, in a line perfect. This OCD of mine, I just look at it and I get confused, and I never liked the button placement of the face controllers. So what I wound up doing is I actually wound up buying third-party GameCube controllers for myself to play, because I like to have all the buttons lined up in a similar style where it's like X, Y, A, B, or B, A, or whatever it was. And I still use those whenever I play GameCube games. It's the only way I can do it. I just never got used to it, and maybe that's my own fault for not just sticking it out with Nintendo's controllers. But I was too busy just fighting it.
I think I think your problem is you're playing fighting games on something other than a console that has Neo Geo in the name. I think that's your big problem. But no, I'm just kidding about that. But I think like the Neo Geo like systems in the pockets are great for fighters. But yeah, that's an issue for fighting games. I don't like fighting games very much, except for like Tekken, and Bloody Roar played fine on it though. I felt
Soul Calibur, Soul Calibur 2. No, I couldn't with Link. I went from the Dreamcast to the GameCube, and that was like Soul Cal 1 I loved, and when I played Soul Cal 2 with the GameCube controller, I was like, this is crazy. Phantasy Star Online, that was another one we talked about a couple weeks ago. When that came up for the GameCube, I was so excited to play Phantasy Star Online Episode 2, but it was that damn controller, so I had to get that third-party controller just to play it and enjoy it. I don't know what it was. I just couldn't get used to it.
I never had many problems with it, but then I didn't play many fighting games on it. But I'm like, if I handed this to anyone, if I handed this controller to anyone, they would know what to do with it. I think, like they would know, they would know which button to press when they're trying to interact with something, like because it makes the A button so important. And they kind of kept it over with the Wii, but I felt like the Wii controller didn't really conform to the hand anywhere near as well.
I like the GameCube controller just because it's so comfortable, but I mean that's so subjective.
I did mention that too. I think the molding is wonderful. I think it fits in your hands. I like the triggers. I mean everything about it. I just have issues with the face controllers or the face buttons on it. That's why when we play like Smash Brothers on like the Wii or something, I always want to use a classic controller or else my own like third-party GameCube controllers. I just can't do the big ass big green button. It isn't me. I don't know why. If I wanted one button on a controller, I'd be playing Atari, where I have the only option is the one button on it. The GameCube controller.
It's not about having the one button. It's about making it the most important.
I guess. But
yeah, it's very well. Like I'm sure Aaron already went over this, but I really like the design behind it. The idea that the buttons are laid out in such a way that no matter what game you're playing, you can know kind of the hierarchy. So.
Yeah.
How come on the Wii U, like the Wii U tablet, how come they didn't do the layout with that style?
Because they were trying to go after like the hardcore gamers that were with the PS3 and 360. I mean, that was basically like Nintendo's set out. That's what killed the Wii U, kind of. Because I mean, it's going to die. Like the NX is going to come in and it's going to replace it at probably the end of next year or the beginning of 2017. But what kind of killed it was the fact that they were aiming towards the hardcore crowd, and then they were like, "But we still want the Wii audience, so we're going to call it the Wii U," which basically turned the hardcore crowd into being like, "I'm not going to have the console named the Wii." And like for the family crowd, they were like, "Oh, so it's a new controller?" And it's like their whole naming convention ruined that. If they called it like the Super Wii, all right, okay.
I don't know. Yeah, that's a whole humongous talk right there. I like the Wii U a lot too, and I think a lot of people wish that it would have done well, and a lot of people, whoever owns it and plays the game love it. You know, it could go. You could play that thing forever.
Yeah,
it's a huge, amazing system. But yeah, I've heard so many people say like, "Oh, I don't want to get a Wii U because I don't want to have to use that controller. I don't want to have to." Because I already got the controllers. I don't need a Wii U controller, right? And it's like, no, this is a whole new system. This is a whole new system. Like, what? Really? And then they try to buy Wii U games for their Wii or whatever, and they put it in, they bring it back, and they're like, this doesn't work. And it's like, what do you mean it doesn't work? Like, I bought this Wii U game and it won't work in the Wii. It's not a Wii game.
Yeah, it is a horrible name. It's interesting, too, when people talk about the controller, because I've heard people mention that either their hands are too big or their hands are too small. And I don't know anyone who has, like, directly, who has bigger hands than I have because I'm freaking massive. And I find the controller comfortable. And my nephews, who are, like, 8 and tiny, like, they find it comfortable. And like, I'm kind of wondering, like, have you held the actual gamepad, or are you just looking at it from afar and going, that looks like it'll be difficult to hold? Because it does. Like, if you look at it from afar, it looks like it'll be a pain in the ass to hold. But then when you actually hold it, it's really comfortable. And I think the only things I would find more comfortable, well, not the only things, but like it's a pretty comfortable controller because I think Nintendo does that pretty well, except for the exception of maybe the N64. But even then, it's still kind of comfortable. The like you mentioned the comfort of the GameCube, and Richard mentioned it was like his most comfortable controller ever. And for me, I think the PlayStation 4 controller is probably the most comfortable I've had to hold. Because it fits to big hands really well, and also kind of fits to smaller hands just fine. And because it's spaced out, the grips are spaced out a lot more than a lot of other controllers, and it has those pistol grips, which are perfect for holding. Although apparently some people like the Steam controller for holding, but I mean that's only been out for like a day, so reserve judgment on that.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. You guys both like the GameCube controller. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but it's an interesting idea. I think that it has a lot to do with which type of games you like to play. What is your favorite genres? If it's a controller that maybe wouldn't work for that, maybe it's not going to be a controller that you'll ever want to use for it. And like the types of games that I love more than anything are like old school RPGs, adventure games, side scrollers, shoot 'em ups, run and guns, fighting games. Like these are the kind of things, and I understand that's all what you consider retro or old school or whatever. But when the GameCube controller came out, it was like I kind of came to the realization that what my type of games were, the types of things that I loved, like running up high scores or playing in fighting game tournaments, things like that. It was kind of like that time had ended, and the GameCube controller wasn't going to be able to support those types of games. Even knowing things like God, what was it? The Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, which is a side-scrolling action game, was really fun. Or Beautiful Joe. Actually, no, I'm sorry. Goemon came out on the N64, but Beautiful Joe on the GameCube were really fun games as side-scrolling, games. Alien Hominid was a really fun game on that. It was really, for me, it was very tough to play with the GameCube controller, and I think almost impossible was when Mega Man Anniversary Collection came out, which was Mega Man's 1 through 8 on the GameCube and the PS2. And I really had a hard time with the GameCube version. It was not, you had no ability to map buttons differently, and they had, I think they had switched A and B around from what I was used to playing on the NES, or something like that, and it was just, the GameCube controller it kept, like, I was like, at first it's like, oh, this is interesting, I'll get used to it. Gotta hate it. Now I can't play this game, and it's just every time, and I'm like, I don't even like to touch it anymore.
I felt you mentioned shoot 'em ups, and I kind of felt like, I mean, I played Ikaruga on the Dreamcast and on the GameCube, and I liked it more on the GameCube than I did on
A button
Dreamcast.
shoots. I mean, you know exactly which
Sure.
button is going to shoot.
It's
That's
true.
true. Yeah, you got shoot, you got bomb, and you got L and R's for switching colors. No, it played wonderful on the GameCube. It plays. I think it plays pretty equally on both ways. It only came out in Japan on the Dreamcast, so I don't know if they had more features that they were added into the U.S. version when it was actually translated over here. And the GameCube had a couple other ones too. I can't think of what it was, and I had them all. There were some really good games, and there was even one that we didn't get. Or there was a few that we didn't get in the U.S. But yeah, I don't know. A handful of games is nice, but I want a big selection of games.
It had Luigi's Mansion.
Luigi's Mansion's a very cool game. I love that. It's very fun. I mean, GameCube has a ton of great games. I have no issue saying the GameCube is a very fun system. When I got to play Crystal Chronicles, Final Fantasy game, using a Game Boy Advanced, that was like heaven for me. I got to use this, not have to use the GameCube controller playing multiplayer with friends. I loved Crystal Chronicles. I loved Zelda Four Swords. Those were so fun. Pac-Man Versus, those kind of games. So imaginative and fun and just excellent games. I think Mario Kart Double Dash is amazing. I mean, that is like super, super fun game. Gazillions of really great GameCube games for sure. I thought the GameCube was Nintendo going in the right direction for sure. There was so much more available for that system. Even knowing it had sold a lot less here in the U.S., I thought that was a great system. Absolutely great system. But I don't know. I can't think of any handheld, or, sorry, any controller that I would use that would be worse than the GameCube one, other than like the Atari Jaguar one or the 5200. Like Atari, notoriously after they came out with the original Atari 2600 controller, have made terrible, terrible controllers.
Even the 2600 one isn't that great, to be honest.
The 2600 one is shit.
It's like the first controller. Like, yeah, I don't know.
That's the thing about old controllers, is you can't really judge them too hard because they didn't have anything to go off of. So
yeah, the NES controller was brilliant when that came out. It was amazing how they had like gone from doing this to like actually holding it and thinking about how you had to control things. I love the evolution of that style of controller, how it went from that to the Genesis adding a controller and making that mold kind of around your hand, so it was a little more comfortable. TurboGrafx had the exact same style as the NES, but it was more rounded on the edges, so it didn't cut in your hands. It had turbo switches on it, so you could cheat in some games or like get a little bit, shoot them up so you can click on the turbo and just hold the button instead of having to rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat on it the whole time. That was awesome. I have a very huge soft spot for the turbo in my life. It's my favorite system ever. It was like the coolest thing that I had ever seen when I first got into it. The first system that had CD attachments. I could talk about that for 50 hours if you wanted me to, but but I can't really say anything more about like the GameCube controller other than it just wasn't for me. But I can see why people would like it. I really could. I mean, I think it's a handheld. It's a controller that you could give to anybody and say the main button is this one, and then people would kind of get used to it by that point, and you may be even able to feel around because all the buttons are different feelings that you can actually kind of figure out where they are without having to look down as much. Whereas like, the Xbox, the PS4 or whatever, how they have X on top on one of them and then the X is on the left side on one of them, it can be very confusing trying to remember it.
Took me way too long to memorize the button layout for the PlayStation. That shit drove me crazy for the longest time.
I'm not sure I even have it memorized now. I think X is top.
No.
And square is bottom?
No, X.
X is the bottom one?
I think circle is to the right.
Triangle top.
Yeah.
Square is left, and then circle.
I always got square and circle mixed up. Like I didn't know which one was left and right. So
it doesn't help that they're very, very slightly different colors either.
Yeah.
Like it's just like
red.
It's like almost red orange and then pinkish. It's not particularly.
Yeah.
But
yeah. You had to play a lot of Bust-A-Groove and Parappa the Rappa to get used to those, because Parappa like forced you to memorize them with all the different commands that you could do, and that helped. Playing those kinds of games actually helped me memorize those buttons. But by the time the Dreamcast came out, I was totally in Dreamcast land, playing Space Channel 5 instead of Parappa. But
I never had an issue with it. I don't know why. I think they just like picked it up, looked at it, was like, okay, those are the controls, and then done with it. Like with the button layout on the PlayStation, it never really bothered me that much. The biggest face button problems I've ever had are with the 360 and just the fact that like they're jewels that like dig into my finger every time I press them. I hate that. Yeah, I don't like that they're like super rounded. I prefer flat.
Yeah, I just thought I just don't like the ergonomics of the 360 controller. Like I thought it was laid out just fine. It's just I didn't like the way it felt. I'm the same way with the PlayStation controller. Honestly, like I just don't like the way it fits into my hand. But I mean that's so subjective. Like anyone's, I think most people are going to say something different with regards to that.
Right. I think that a lot of people, and it's interesting to hear conversations of people that are fans of the Xbox style and people that are fans of the PlayStation style, where they did the only real difference, and I know there's lots of differences, but the big major difference is that the D-pad and the analog sticks are switched. On the 360 or the Xbox style, you have the very first thing that your thumb will touch is that analog stick, whereas on the PlayStation, the analog sticks are closer together and the D-pad is there. And I've heard a lot of people that have main interests in the PlayStation side say it's so much more important to have the D-pad there for menus or whatever, and then to be able to reach in and use the analog stick. Whereas it's totally opposite on the 360. Do you guys have a preference on that at all?
I honestly like the joystick to be not down. Like, I think on the PlayStation controller, it's really kind of shoehorned in. Like, they obviously designed the controller, and then they said, "Oh, we need joysticks because everyone's got joysticks now. Let's put them here." And they stuck with that design for so long, but honestly, I can't stand it because you're primarily using a joystick, but it's way out of the way. I really like it being front and center, like, because it's a thing you're using primarily most of the time. So.
Right. If I have a choice in a game, especially if it's a 2D game, I always use the D-pad though.
Oh yeah, yeah, me as well.
So the way I look at it is like, I don't know. I mean, it is kind of out of the way on the PlayStation controller, but for me personally, I like how big the D-pad is in the PlayStation controller as a result of it being up there instead of being like down, where you can have the joysticks be smaller and change the shape or whatever, and it'll be fine where it's sitting on the PlayStation controller. But on the 360, I feel like the D-pad is too small, and also like bubbly. Which is a problem that I have with a lot of D-pads.
It's not a very good D-pad, no.
No, it's not. And yeah, we're just about out of time here, but is there anything else that you guys wanted to quick talk about, one more round around? I know we had talked about earlier about doing maybe a conversation about what we think is the worst, most popular consoles, and maybe we can save that for another time.
Yeah.
But if there's anything else, I know that the handheld, or I keep saying handheld, the controller chat is kind of coming to an end here. But do you have any last remarks that you want to make at all about the GameCube or any kind of controllers that are your least or happy or favorite type of controllers?
The R-Zone has probably the objectively worst controller ever made.
Yes, I agree.
The reason for that is the plus pad and also the buttons are these like dipped things with ridges on the edges.
Yep.
So when you press them, you're pressing up against a sharp plastic ridge. It's just insanely uncomfortable, which, I mean, it doesn't really matter because you're not going to play it for longer than like a minute.
Yeah.
Even in a best case scenario, but still.
It is pretty horrible. But we've already decided the R-Zone cannot be considered cannot be considered a console.
No, that's giving it too much credit.
But if it was, yeah, it's hands down the worst controller and the worst system I've ever seen. It's just awful.
I feel like, I don't know, like the whole, like every Atari controller is just like, there's no way to play the game with an Atari controller and not end up with carpal tunnel. And I feel like like you could play it for like 2 seconds and it doesn't matter. You're gonna be like, oh god, my wrist. Why did I play this? So I feel like whenever you're playing those and you're not using a Genesis controller, you're just doing it wrong. Like, I feel like you should be using a Genesis controller. Just do that.
Yeah, the Atari Jaguar was Atari's last effort as far as making their own console, and it's such a bizarre It's such a bizarre feeling. They basically wanted to emulate the Genesis controller in a certain way by only having the 3 face buttons. Then it had 12 buttons that were in a pattern of like a phone. I guess you'd want to phone a friend if you have any issues or try to put a password in. It was the strangest thing ever, and that one is, and it's faulty too. It is, the D-pad is miserable.
It just never works. Yeah.
They're just like, oh,
has the overlays. Fine. Has little plastic overlays that go into it, so you can tell what the numpad buttons do.
Yep.
It's very strange.
Yeah, it was out there. But thank you guys so much for being a part of the show. I'm really glad that you guys got to hang out with us. We went over by about a half an hour, but I think we had pretty fun, good conversation. And I hope that a few of the viewers that have popped in and out during the time will definitely let me know in the comments below on the YouTube channel, or let us know via the social network. You can check me out on Twitter at _JoshuaTurbo. You can message me during the show, after the show, anytime you want to let us give us some ideas or advice or criticisms, if you wish, about what we should talk about next or what we should fix in future episodes. And also, if Aaron and Rich have any any little blurbs they want to throw out, go for it now. And otherwise, we're going to fade out and talk to you guys next time.
All right. Well, I'm on Bandcamp, coolor.bandcamp.com. That's my name over there somewhere. Yeah, there. At bandcamp.com. Or not, well, you know, however they do it, I don't know. Look it up on Google. And yeah, that's about it. It was fun talking to all you guys and arguing about everything like we usually do, Aaron. And hope to do it again.
Yep. I don't really have. I mean, if I had my lower third thing up, I would have either my Twitter handle or my YouTube channel there. But just KH Cloud is usually the name. So YouTube KH Cloud, that's my channel. And
those are the letters KH Cloud, right?
Yep. Stands for Kingdom Hearts Cloud, because I really like that game.
Nerd.
And I still really like it. No.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, thank you guys again for being on the show, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll check you guys out next time. See ya.
See ya.